James, welcome to the Next Big Idea podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I have to say that I had a really strange reaction to your book, which was I've been saying for years that the thought leader conversation about work is, well, for a long time it was dominated by economists, and now we finally have lots of psychologists into it, and we desperately need anthropologists.
Yeah,
And after reading work, I think I've understated the case. You've made it very clear that we should all be listening to and learning from not only anthropologists, but especially from you. I know I wrote you at some point that I've been studying work my whole career. It's 2 decades now, and I cannot remember the last time I learned so much about it in one sitting and in one book, and I just could not put it down. So congratulations.
Thank you. Well, you're pinking me up in this miserable light. It's probably a good thing that it's so dark and gloomy here in Blighty. Can't see my blushes.
Mission accomplished. I think I've also been waiting for someone to write a real history of work, and you went back so much further than I ever imagined that would go. So I guess the place I want to start is with the first insight that really blew my mind in this book, which is I thought one of the major points of the Industrial Revolution was that we could automate a lot of work and we would work less. And you say, no, not so much. In fact, our hunter-gatherer ancestors actually worked substantially less than we do. Is this really true?
Well, Adam, I can't speak for all our hunter-gatherer ancestors for all time, but I can really look at only our contemporary hunter-gatherers and say, work creates us. The way we work, the way we make a living, hunting and gathering seems to produce some very distinctive social forms as a way of making a living. And those social forms seem to be fairly consistent, and they seem to prioritize meeting short-term needs, not worrying a great deal about the future, not being hostage to the future. That's really what it is. One reviewer described it as the Sunday scaries, and he was talking about his feeling on the weekend that he could never relax, that he always felt that there was something to do. Whereas Junmasi definitely were able to relax once they had their needs met. That didn't mean they were ever idle. It didn't mean that they always did the work that needed to be done. And sometimes that could be damn hard. The Kalahari Desert's a tough place. And, certainly where some of our ancestors lived, they would have worked just as hard as Hans Junmasi in the driest, toughest seasons where hunting is crazy difficult. But I think in all instances, they organized their economies that once their basic material needs were met, they took the business of leisure quite seriously. And, when we look at, and again, we can only guess, when we look at sort of some ancient archaeological sites, like there's that site in South Africa that I write about, Blombos Cave, with its kind of surf and turf dining opportunities. And, I've spent a lot of time in that area, and I walk down to the beach and pick mussels off the shore, and, and I've been there when a whale's been beached, and we know that they ate beached whales, and inland, their little rock hyraxes dashing around. Food is relatively plentiful, and that, unsurprisingly, is the first place we see the kind of real evidence of the stirrings of creativity with, the first obvious jewelry, the first obvious art. I think our hunter-gatherers had something on us, and certainly for me, it's a question that I've asked: why when we have this great abundance, do we not, at least why are we not at least doing work we love at the very least, rather than even if not working less.
James, that goes to one of the things that I've been most curious about, which is you've not only studied these hunter-gatherers in Namibia and Botswana, you've lived with them, you've worked with them. Have you become more like them? How has this philosophy of work changed your own ethos?
Well, look, the truth is the era that I've been there. I mean, when I started working with them, really hunting and gathering was something, when we went hunting, we did so illegally on land that had been taken from them. We were effectively poachers. We were hiding from farmers with guns and, conservation officials and all sorts of things. And same with gathering, to go out gathering food in the desert. Actually, their land had all been whipped away and they'd been forced into our system of labor in a very brutal sense. They'd been like, right, now you're going to be farm laborers. And so part of the reason I got into this, part of this different, the reason I got such a sense of this difference was not through living with them as absolutely pristine hunter-gatherers, but rather through living amongst people who are trying to negotiate their way into our kind of economy based on reward and labor, and really at the absolute lowest run. And their absolute bewilderment and confusion, and also the kind of, the incredibly racist stereotypes it produced from the white farmers, who tell me, oh, the Bushmen are lazy, they are this, that, and the other. And it was all to do with this sort of ideas about work falling in the cavern between two very fundamental ways of engaging with the economic world. And the truth is now that most Jinwasi and many other San, Jinwasi are just one group of these Kalahari hunter-gatherers, they're all, now in many ways, but certainly this was a big topic in my last book, is they are, because of their engagement with this economy, they are in many instances what you call a slummified underclass who are living on crime, and their engagement in our world has not been a pleasant experience.
No. And so what impact has that had on you then? If you think about the James Suzman who existed before going into the hunter-gatherer world and the one who came out, how did your own attitudes and behaviors around work change?
Well, certainly. Look, I don't think they changed hugely. I'll be honest with you. I think I always had a kind of leisured streak within me. In my family, my brother was the notoriously hard worker, and I was told I always got by on trying to be charming and articulate rather than putting in the effort. So, I found, look, anthropology is a very strange experience. It's like doing this kind of field work, it's the same. When most of us travel, we go to places and we often have instinctive reactions to them. There's certainly many cities on Earth and countries I've been to where I just haven't felt naturally at home. I actually quite look forward to going back to my home. When I got into the Kalahari Desert, I felt very much at home. And with the individuals, we saw each other and we understood each other. So in many senses, and I started this when I was 20. These are some of the most important human relationships of my life. They are, I literally have fathers, uncles. My children are named after them because in the Jinhua world, your name determines your relationship. So if you share the name so my son is called Kate, for example, which is my name-father's name, and it means my name-father becomes his grandfather, and they treat each other in certain ways. And so, I remain very much locked in there, and this now is the longest period I haven't been to see them, courtesy of COVID, and I'm really quite worried about whether I'll get a chance to go even this year. But yes, it's changed me profoundly, and it also, in maybe some ways, helped me find who I am. And as I discovered when I did my stint in the corporate world, I kind of beat a hasty retreat after 7 years back to a world I'm more comfortable with.
How many hours a week do you work now?
Well, it's interesting. It depends on how you define work. I'm a single father, so part of my decision for becoming a writer full time really is to be there for my children. I also swore after my 7 years of corporate life and commuting, I commuted 4 hours a day to London and back. And I swore I'm going to play sport every day. So up until COVID, again, I'd make sure I played sport every day. But then I'm a writer and I do various odd projects with the Jinwasi still. I actually set up a consultancy organization when I left De Beers, and I've done nothing with it other than human rights work. So in reality, I think I probably do about 2 or 3 good hours work a day. But as you know, when you're writing, your brain is always going. So when I'm going through the supermarket, when I'm going to the squash courts, when I'm looking after my children, my mind is continuously motoring through an idea, a way of saying something, a way of thinking about something, or even to write. So writing never lets you off, really, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I guess that leads me to the question of what do the hunter-gatherers of the Kalahari that you've gotten to know, What do they make of the fact that you not only work more than they do, but you've written a whole book about work? Do they think that's even a worthwhile pursuit?
They actually don't know I've written a book about work because I was so damn busy writing it, and I found it quite hard to tell them. And I actually, I only was able to visit them once I'd finished it, and they thought it sounded like an extremely boring subject. They also, and again, I mean, remembering how things have changed, work for them, has very negative connotations now because work is something that you generally do for, the ranchers who've taken their land. And often work is something which doesn't come with pay. So they thought it was vaguely interesting, but yeah, look, they've been, we've all been, one of the beauties of this relationship is we've been cheerfully mystified by one another for 30 odd years now. And it's a very good way to be. We're intrigued and sympathetic and confused by each other. And they find my attitudes to work very bizarre, but they likewise, they're adapting to the world and they're coming to terms with having to work. They often work tougher, longer hours than I do now. So
Cheerfully mystified. I think that's
yes.
a great place to be. It's a delightful way of capturing openness to a very foreign culture and probably an unfamiliar world. I think that one of the things your research has really led me to think and rethink a lot about is the purpose of work in our lives. Talk to me a little bit about how your data, your studies, your observations, and your experiences have shifted your thinking about what work means in society.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, going down, deciding to actually write the book about work. I mean, when I started, I had this idea of something around a comparison between how the Jinwasi organize their working life and the economic ideas around it and how we do. And it turned into something of a wormhole because work is one of these words that we all use and we all have a very intuitive sense of what it means. We use it in lots of different contexts very cleverly and very quickly. We work at relationships, we work at sports, we work at our jobs, we work at learning, we work at... Well, it's such a pliable word, but we all know what it means. But when you try and pin down what it means, it suddenly reveals this extraordinary slipperiness. And what it seems to me is, there's certainly two things in work. One is the very fundamental thing of meeting our basic needs. And what those are, we can all debate. But then the rest of it is something far more flexible. One person's work is another person's leisure. So Jinwasi, for example, when the elephant hunters come from Europe and America to blow away innocent jumbos, the Jinwasi are sort of, they cannot understand, and the Jinwasi know that, this hunting by foreigners is what sustains their community organization and allows them to effectively live outside the mainstream economy in many respects. But they're mystified why these people pay such huge amounts of money to kill an animal that's too big to eat, and that's very human-like anyway. As they say, elephants have two breasts, and they say which is very unusual in the animal kingdom. And why they pay such a huge amount of money to do this when they say this is work. This is hard and dangerous work. Why do they work all year at another job to come and do this hard and dangerous work? And the fact that much of the work, much of what we do for pleasure is actually work. I cook for pleasure. I fish for pleasure. I pay money to go fishing. I can't afford to go fishing most of the time. So these inversions of what is work and not work are actually often context-based. And that, again, raises a whole series of questions of why are we doing certain kinds of work. So for me, it keeps boiled down to that question, when our basic needs are met, or when we are collectively resourced to meet everybody's basic needs, why aren't we creating an environment that enables people to do the work they love, rather than desperately try and learn to love the work that they find and have to do? And that, that for me is, I suppose, the crux of it. We have this extraordinary creativity within us. I mean, for me in the book, charting that evolutionary journey, charting everything from our neuroplasticity to the history written in the various tools, history of a species that is purposeful, that finds, that is good at collecting energy. And when they get that energy, excess energy, they do creative things with it. And that's what we have. We have that energy, but we're instead funneling people into doing really quite miserable things with it most of the time. So we're born to work, I think, but I think it's almost criminal that we're as wealthy as we are, in a sense, and people still have to do miserable work, or lots of miserable work.
I'm inclined to agree with you. And in some ways, this is sort of the holy grail of my field of organizational psychology, is to say, what can we do to design work that people find motivating and meaningful and enjoyable? And some of the pushback I've gotten over the years, including from my own sister, is to say, look, not everyone needs to have a calling, right? It's okay to have a job or to have a career. And when I've looked at the data, it does seem to be true. If you look at Amy Resnesky's research, for example, that people who see their work as a calling, on average, are happier in life, but they also struggle more with questions of work-life balance. And it's really left me questioning whether we should expect everyone to love their work, or whether, in fact, we should try to set an upper bound so that people don't work 80 or 90 hours in a job that they hate, but still make it okay to have a job. And it sounds like you're pushing against that.
Well, no, I think it's great to have a job. I think what I'd like to see is for people to really have that choice. So, again, the world is full of very different people. There's some very individualistic go-getters who want to shape their own destiny and are very difficult to compartmentalize into an institutional space. It's probably one of the reasons why I wasn't that brilliant in the corporate environment in the end of it. But there are also certainly loads of people there who like the structure, they like the rules, they found that society within it, because that is really where our society has evolved, where 200 years ago our identity was based on shared geography, shared kinship, often shared religious practices, shared local identity. In cities, it's based on shared work. And that's also that shared physical practice. So it offers us a certain amount of structure. And so in a sense where we say people are saying, well, we'd like, some people do like jobs. Yes, people like identities and a sense of belonging and being. That doesn't need to come from a job. For the moment, it does. But again, I think that's a hangover of the way we're organizing our economy. I also have extraordinary confidence that people find things to do when they don't have something to do. And that's absolutely everybody. For many of us, it's just easy to say, oh, I'll just go and do my job. I don't have to think about it. But actually, take away a job from somebody and put them in a context where they have choices. Then you'll find that they almost always do something with it. So we see that with the experiments with universal basic income. As long as people have choices, they do it. When they don't have choices, being without a job, unemployment is a miserable thing. It's an isolating, hideous thing. But when you have choices, it's different. And this is why I've kept going back. I battle with the same question as you. And I keep going back to, imagine if our economy was organized in just completely different conceptual grounds. Imagine if we could sort of tear it apart, take away the institutions that everybody's expected to work in certain ways, and created institutions which encouraged everybody to work. It allowed some people, if they were genuine idlers, to actually idle. There's lots of people who make a living playing computer games online now. Let them, in a sense, do it. I imagine that in a nurturing space, people will do wonderful things, I think.
Well, I want to know how we got here. You said this was a hangover a bit, our attitudes toward work, and I think you really shattered one of my assumptions, another one of my assumptions, in pointing out that what I thought was caused by the Industrial Revolution actually traces much further back to the Agricultural Revolution. So I guess I've assumed for a long time that the attitudes we have about work defining us, about productivity being a measure of our worth, that those really grew out of the manufacturing economy, where we wanted to produce as much as possible, where we had Taylorism and time and motion studies trying to figure out how to be as efficient as possible. And you say, no, this isn't 200-300 years back. This goes back 10,000 years Tell
Yeah.
me what exactly led you to that insight, and how we should understand the role of farming in shaping our philosophies and ideologies about work.
Well, again, this is bizarrely another product of the anthropological field experience. So, partially, as I said, I was dealing with Jumwasi, trying to cope with adapting to farming and the difficulties they had in adapting to the calendar, the fact that they needed to focus on a field for a period of over a year, but also in the context of all their neighbors, all the people that had taken their land, apart from there were the, mainly white Afrikaner cattle ranchers who'd taken tons of the land during apartheid. But the other people who'd taken it were other groups like the Kavango and the Herero and the Botswana, who were established agricultural economies, who grew mahangu and herded cattle. Mahangu is a millet, and herded cattle. And so I was in proximity of these two cultures. And for the guys who are growing mahangu, when you're doing it in an area as tough as, the Kalahari, even if they're doing it near the banks of the Kavango River, suddenly you become unbelievably aware. The amount of nights I spent with people trying to chase baboons from the crops, trying to build fences strong enough to keep the elephants out, trying to maintain these just hordes of insect pests that would come in plagues. And then at the same time, trying to deal with things like the actual physical plagues that came and affected humans, from, bizarre blackwater fever to, tsetse flies to various zoonotic diseases. That contrast was so profound. And that famous study I talk about by Richard Lee, who went and did the first time in motion studies effectively with the Jumwasi. And when he went and did this back in Botswana, it was, in those days, Botswana was unbelievably remote and poor. And they were going through a hideous drought when he was making his way up to a place called Kaikai. And he was going through all these agricultural settlements where their cattle farmed and people were starving, and there was a relief operation under the way. And Richard Lee thought the project was going to be ruined because he was going to get to Kaikai and these poor starving hunter-gatherers were going to be on the edge of death. He arrived there and everybody was fine. No. So this sort of exposure of risk and panic and labor requirements around it became, it was very, very clear. And again, it becomes very viscerally clear when you're dealing with, and, to use subsistence farmers in Africa as an analog for early Neolithic farmers, is, it's rough, but it gives you a hint of the challenges they endured. And there's no doubt, you'd go from one person's shamba to another person's shamba, and the guy who worked hard, the guy who really worked hard and had their, and all their kids worked. I mean, as soon as the kids could walk, they were working. And often they'd actually keep the youngest kid at home. They're like, the oldest one would go to school, the youngest would, he's going to stay here and look after us, they'd say. But it was really the amount of work that they did that made the difference between whether they had a granary that was full and a herd of cattle that was still alive, and those who ended up being broken and then is accused of being a freeloader and often ended up drifting miserably to city fringes to try their luck. So it was very vivid. You can really see it. And so in the process of writing the book, I just wanted to dive much deeper into that. And it was a real pleasure to suddenly start going deep into the Neolithic history. And of course, with all the wonderful things of genomics now, that we can sort of see these historical population bottlenecks. And the Neolithic flowering it rapidly expanded over the planet. But there's so many stories in the archaeological record of these little tendrils, these blossoms, just breaking and disappearing as they die and depart. And these were whole populations that would have been wiped out by a drought or a flood, or very often also a zoonotic disease contracted from their cattle.
And so you get the agricultural revolution coming. We get the advent of farming. Why is that so pivotal in making work central to our lives and our identities?
Well, firstly, it's because work became a really critical thing in the energy equation. That's the first step. The second thing was that you actually started getting, out of that cycle, you started getting surpluses. And out of those surpluses, because you had surpluses, survival not only depended on producing those surpluses, but suddenly the control, maintenance, and management of those surpluses. So you ended up creating another class of people, often a very small class, usually only 1 in 5, and roughly 20% in the most sophisticated agricultural populations, who then could cleave off effectively from the rest and use their time and effort spending that energy, often spending it on controlling it or, just managing its distribution. But you ended up producing the space. The surplus energy created the creative space for a whole series of another different kind of roles, and ultimately the birth of cities. And when people got to cities, everything changed, because in cities the job is all to do with spending money. And out of that is the great crux of human creativity. Cities are creative spaces. Every city, almost instantly from the very first ones, you see this instant efflorescence of different professions, skills, artisanship. And within those cities as well, you also see in the record the extent to which these things became intimate form of identity for people. So you had, for example, Rome was organized around trade guilds where people married in. And we see, of course, in places like India, it's absolutely institutionalized in the caste system, where you are born into your job. And of course, we saw that historically with many of the Western European populations too. So hence the names like Smith and Farrier and so on. So as soon as you got into cities, work became a matter of identity. And part of it is a fundamental thing. The reason partially you and I are getting on well here, is both of us work with the same thing. We work with words, and we work with ideas, and that's a shared experience. That creates very strong common ground. So when two people are working in a space, whether they're a cleaner, or whether they're a butcher, whether they're a shoemaker, it creates this kind of community of experience. And that produces a forge for identity. It also, generally because people tend to be bracketed by their job, it also makes people interact with them in some way. So in all the things that come together to shape our individual identities tend to be shaped ever more by work. So, when you're the farmer in the field, you have all these attitudes about how much you have to work and the obvious importance of the energy equation and not freeloading. But those same attitudes then come to the city, and those are shaped by the spending of energy, and then work becomes a basis for identity. And this is why, again, you see in all through history the emergence of similar categories of people: religious professionals, scribe professionals, of course soldiers, who specialize in specific forms of work.
Well, this raises a few questions for me that I think are interesting as we start to chart the future of work. One of which is, if we go in the direction that you're mapping out for us, which is to give people a choice and say, if you prefer to work 15 hours a week and subsist on that, we want to free up your time to do that. It would make it awfully difficult to accomplish great things. Let's take the pandemic of the past year. I don't think we'd have COVID vaccines if people were working 15 hours a week. Is your vision that there are certain organizations, certain occupations, certain jobs where people will naturally be drawn by the meaning to work more?
Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. We both live, I suppose Cambridge is a slightly more amplified town in that sense. But, part of the reason I live here, and actually is that I'm in a town where very few people are doing the work for anything but the love of it. And they're all really good at it, and they're all really motivated. And strangely enough, this is where AstraZeneca headquarters are. And, we're actually getting this incredible sort of biotech boom happening right here. I look out my window from my office and I see the Addenbrooke site with these vast buildings and things spilling up. I have always, in my sort of esoteric world of academia and be outside of that, I've always engaged with people who've got on and done the important work. And I think that's the thing, that with things like, social capital is a great thing to work for. And I think part of the problem is we get some of the most energetic, brainy, wonderful people who just through need or convention or the way our economy incentivizes things, you end up with these great, there was a nameless anthropology student who was absolutely brilliant in my year and was destined to do great things, has ended up as a corporate lawyer, very good corporate lawyer, but he was incentivized by the system effectively to do one kind of role, whereas he would have been an absolutely wonderful anthropologist, and I suspect it's something he's probably always regretted. I mean, we're not as in touch. So I tend to be optimistic, and I think it's an experiment worth doing. That's, again, my other thing, is we don't know the answers. I don't really have a vision for the future. I have a vision for experimenting and learning. It's partially my big bugbear is like people I've been asked, I end up at a million conferences. Well, what's the future going to be like? I have no idea. What should it be? I have no idea. But what I'd really like to do is say, these are problems we can identify. Let's experiment. Let's try something big like universal basic income, a 4-day week. Or, as we did in the last year, a large-scale experiment in flexible working. Let's see what happens. And let's take what we learn from it. Let's call it an experiment. Instead, we have this political system at the moment that we keep wanting people to come with ready-made answers. And when those ready-made answers obviously don't work, we sit there and go, well, you're out now. I'd love, as I was saying in an interview with a Spanish paper yesterday, I was like, I think I might start the let's experiment and check stuff out party. And I think that we really are at a point of prosperity where we do have the wiggle room to experiment. And there is, of course, the urgent need to do so, because to me, I can't dissociate our climate-related risks and environmental risks, which are very visible and amplified in places like the Kalahari. You see them in the fringes in a very real way. And for me, I think there's an urgent need to do it. And because we don't have the answers, we have to play, we have to experiment, and we have to learn. And the great thing about experimenting is when you're wrong, you've learned something.
Well, it's fascinating to hear you say this, because we have been having the same conversations with, I think, many of the same members of the press and many of the same leaders using different social scientific tools. The last time I checked, the only way to systematically learn is to run experiments.
Yes.
I really do not know of another method. And yeah, the discovery that you were wrong is a sign that you've actually learned something.
Yes.
That's, for me, just a thrill. It's a rush.
No, exactly.
I
know this is meant to be about me, but actually reading thing again, I was like, well, I wrote that, but just in a different way.
It is remarkable how many of the principles I was trying to capture and think again are played out in your vision of the future of work. And one of the things that I found myself wondering as I was reflecting on, you take this long view of the past and you use it, I think, to hold up a mirror to the present and say, what kind of future do we want to build? It seems like part of that vision is, for a lot of people, the role of work in meaning and identity could shrink. And, I think that there's a part of me that really likes that. There's a part of me that worries. I think about some of the evidence, for example, that when people retire, they often, show... they show a couple of negative responses, right? Sometimes they lose a sense of structure and community. Sometimes they lose meaning. Sometimes their cognitive ability starts to decline. I think Freud was wrong about almost everything, but one of the things he got right was that the two great joys in life were to work and to love. And so if you shrink the role of work, does family become the dominant source of meaning? And where do people get their social capital? Where does the sense of status, the sense of worth come from?
Well, you see, you're sounding just like Emil Durkheim.
Oh, no. Wait, I'm a sociologist now?
Yes, you are. Well done.
Okay, hold on.
Welcome to the club, Adam.
Wait a minute. I didn't know this was going to happen.
I'll send you a badge.
I don't think I've earned it. I've been arguing for years that the vision of collective effervescence, ignores all the individual differences that shape the quality of people's lives that are so important in psychology. But go on.
As I say, I think it's time to experiment. Humans have always had structures, and again, this is where that sort of the anthropology view becomes slightly radicalized. I think of Trobriand islanders. What did they get their structure and meaning from? They got their structure and meaning from taking massive, risky voyages across vast stretches of ocean to deliver cooler rings to people. And then they'd take a separate voyage for trade, but you didn't want to interfere, crass trade with cooler rings. Risking, people are creators and makers of systems of value and meaning around them, no matter what happens. And I think, we have to have the confidence that people will do that. And again, you take a different set of, I suppose, research evidences, and you look at any kind of institution. And certainly this is, as somebody who went to a boarding school and then was expected to go to the army and all sorts of things, you notice that all institutions very quickly develop their own cultures. Often, as we know in corporate life, you have HR people trying to impose a culture on a business, but very rarely do they have a great deal of leeway within that. They've got to use incentives around pay and discipline and so on. Organizations and institutions develop their own cultures, and you develop subcultures within those. So whether it's prisons, whether it's schools, and those things happen no matter, they bounce through and around the structures that are around them. And I tend to think people will have that. I think part of the problem is that our society effectively abandons people when they're retired. And again, this is not something that happens typically in, Junwasi world, for example, or even actually in the agricultural societies that preceded the, retirement's a concept of that's an industrial revolution concept. And as a farmer, you worked effectively until you dropped, or you did whatever you could, performed whatever role you could to maintain your functionality within the community. And in the Junwa world, old people, everybody looked forward to retirement. They got to hang out with children and tell stories. So I think, again, it's a kind of structural thing. All change requires adjustment and learning. All change is a little bit painful. And that's why we're instinctively fearful of it. We're this extraordinarily adaptable species, but we're incredibly intransigent. We hang on to habits, which we know are bad for us. And I'm speaking as somebody who, I blame the Zhengwasi, but I smoked for a long time. We hang on to habits and we try and justify them. We don't go back and, dare I use this word, think again about them. We'd rather try and organize our facts and experiences around them. And society-wise, we can do that as well. We don't have to organize retirement the way we do now. And for example, it was a really encouraging thing. It really sort of, my ears tweaked when it happened. Early on in the pandemic, in Britain, when it was uncertain what this virus was going to be like and what our medical capabilities were going to be, there was the sudden, what they called, using the old war analogy, it was men and women, of course, but they called it the dad's army of doctors. All these retired doctors who were desperate to get back in on the thing. And I think people do want to do stuff and they want the opportunity. And I agree, one of my real bugbears is actually mandatory retirement. I think is a terrible thing. This is where I, keep going back to our level of productivity. Just purely, we have brains to automate so much of the dull stuff that actually we should be indulging people who want to work till they're 126, if that's what they wish to do. But we should also be indulging people which we do, incidentally in professional sport, who want to go and windsurf for the rest of their life. We are productive enough to do that, and I think we'll all be doing ourselves a favor, because actually in doing that, I think people will do less, and my guess is be a little bit happier and probably a little less fraught.
Yeah, and also, maybe their total output will be lower per person or per capita, but I think the value, the quality, the creativity will probably make up for that in a lot of settings. And I think this goes to one of the most important points that you make in the book, which is that if we look at the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago as an inflection point, that we're at another one right now. And that Absolutely. This might be the most important one since 10,000 years ago. Why? Why do we... let me actually break this down into two questions. One is, why is now a critical period as opposed to earlier decades? And then the other one is, what happens if we don't rethink work now?
Yeah, well, it's a good look. It's always, I'm always aware of the sort of tyranny of the moment. One always can, is at risk of overemphasizing the importance of my particular lifetime. But I do think, when I talk about this being an important moment, this moment began with the Industrial Revolution. And it is still going. It is sort of like, if you imagine the speeded up in geological time, this is the car going slowly over the cliff. And we're sort of just tipping there. But that journey began 250 years ago when we started exploiting fossil fuels, and through that energy surge, being able to do vast quantities of work in the raw physical sense. That was it. Before then, all the work we had to do was to get the energy we needed to power our bodies or the animals' bodies. Suddenly we were able to exploit these energy resources, and that distorted everything. We made our economies considerably more capitalized. It created this huge surge in energy and intellectual capital and growth as well. So we developed this extraordinary productivity as a result of it. We haven't learned to live with it. We're sort of a bit like, I feel like we're kind of I'm using a puppy metaphor because I've got a new one. We had to say farewell to our old dog at Christmas, and we have a new one. But you're watching it growing into its body and not really realizing what its capabilities are. And this is, in a sense, something that, even with the digital revolution, the computer revolution, our pocket phones and our laptops are capable of doing far more than we often actually use them for. And we're beginning to feel our way into the capacity of what this can do. But we're still learning it. We're like a teenager learning to use their body and their strength and their intelligence in a certain way. So that's the first thing. We've had this absolute shift in productivity. And, the metaphor I always go back to is just the simple thing. 200 years ago, even in the most sophisticated agricultural civilizations like, pre-industrial revolution, Britain, France, Western Europe, and also northeast United States in the time of Franklin, 80% of people worked the land. 80% of those people, including children, I should add, produced the food they needed to survive. Most of the work they did was to produce the food to power their bodies to produce more food. Now 1.3% of Americans produce so much food that eating too much is a much bigger problem than having too little. So that problem of scarcity has been solved, and that fundamentally changes the basis of what we are working for. That means our work, in many ways, the way we're organizing it, is based on secondary expenditures of energy. And that is in itself an extraordinary revolution, and it's one that we haven't learnt to get to grips with. Now, as an anthropologist, again, I'm very open-minded about culture. If there was, for example, no global climate change, I'd probably be considerably more open-minded about keeping things going the way that they are. But at the moment, we, for example, obsess about productivity and employment. It's a fundamental thing. If we keep thinking that, people are layabouts in society, why do we struggle? Why is it impossible for us to find employment for everybody? Why is this the holy grail of politics, which nobody can ever achieve? And when we do find jobs for people, and there's that wonderful new job index in the States about the quality of work index. I can't remember who put it up. I've been digging around in there. But you've seen, again, particularly since 1980 and that era, the great decoupling, and incidentally the beginning of the new technological boom, you've seen a decline in quality, interesting jobs coming on. And I think, this goes to David Graeber's idea of bullshit jobs. And I think there are lots of people who, really don't need to be working in a sense. And, and I don't want to speak ill of my former employers, but, the art of success at De Beers HQ, especially in my functions, which were corporate affairs, community relations, was persuading the board that you were more important than you actually were. And that was really what promotion in life was about in that corporate space. There was, it was people trying to structure meaning. And you noticed this very particularly when I was there. We were caught out in the 2008 crash where, diamond sales plummeted, and I had to end up getting rid of half my team, and across the business we shed huge numbers of people. And suddenly after that, you actually realize there wasn't a great deal of function around it, that often the way the business was organized, there's a great deal of performativity. We were incredibly efficient when it came to mining, but actually the way we organized the head office was based on, people trying to create their values. Come up, for me, when I look for new staff members, I look for people who are creative enough to come up with new ideas. Come to my office with a great new idea and we'll justify for the budget for it. It was about, and I think we just need different ways of structuring that energy. I mean, for me, it's all about how do we make the best use of the extraordinary human capital that exists in the world. And when I say capital, I mean it in the non-monetary sense. I mean in
Yeah.
a beautiful creative sense.
Well, you captured a lot of attention when you wrote your 300,000 year case for the 15-hour work week, which I thought was such a clever framing of, the idea that that actually we could lead lives of leisure, and we don't have to work as much as we do. Obviously, the 15-hour week is a bridge too far for a lot of modern workplaces. What's the first experiment you'd love to see people run? Would you be rolling the dice with the 4-day work week, with the 6-hour work day, with completely flexible results-only workplaces? Where do you think we ought to start?
Well, I think they're small steps. It's kind of interesting. The problem, for me, an interesting thing over the course of the last year has been the flexible working experiment. Businesses tried it tentatively. Everybody was fiddling around the edges with it before the pandemic struck. And because it was never done at sufficient scale to have any meaning, it always was like, well, it didn't really work. Now we've actually learned. We've learned what has worked with it. We've also learned what hasn't worked with it. But it's because we did this experiment at scale. I'd like to see something happen at scale. A 4-day week for me is just an easy, quick one to do. And they're doing this. I've been doing lots of press in Spain this week, and actually they're launching a big state-wide experiment in the 4-day week with a number of major businesses this week. I'd be really interested to see how that goes. Flexible working, I think we've already crossed a threshold, although that only applies to the small proportion of people who are knowledge workers, in effect. There are many other people who just simply can't have that. But I think if I'd been doing, again, my corporate job, and I was spared that 4 hours of commute a day, which was not only environmentally disastrous, but for my sanity, just terrible, I imagine I might still actually be doing it. So those are small steps to start. I think in terms of the broader economic question, and this goes back to, I'm amazed at how few people seem to talk about the book, but I love Galbraith's The Affluent Society from 1958, where he says, how do we make the best use of our affluence? And I'd like to see us be fairly brave in experimenting around that. I would love to see a big experiment in universal basic income, and I mean a really big one. Because you can't test this particular thing. At the moment in the United States, there's tons of mayors from Stockton to Newark are doing things, and it's, even before Andrew Yang was shouting about it in his bid for the presidency, people were doing, but we've never been able to do the experiment large enough to actually see what it would do. I imagine that is an experiment. For me, the most interesting thing about UBI is that if everybody's basic needs are met, might we create a world where people start doing things for social capital? Like, I wish I didn't have to actually worry about the number of sale receipts I get from my book because I need to pay for my mortgage and so on. I wish I could actually really just worry about how people responded to it. And this is, I think I think universal basic income, a test in that, could actually be something. Yeah, I would love to see that done. And if there is for me a silver lining for this pandemic, it's pushed many people over the edge of actually recognizing that things like government support is not that bad. In fact, actually, it's essential. And that even if you want to work hard and make your money, maybe circumstances in the world aren't going to enable you. But we are rich and powerful enough these days to actually, nevertheless, make sure everybody can sustain themselves. And I think a really big, ambitious experiment that way. Spain, again, actually got all geared up to do it in July. But then they kind of backtracked a little bit. But yeah, those are two things I'd love to see. And they are, as I said, experiments. We've got to embrace them as experiments and then step back if they don't work. But we can't tell. So when you've got the opponents saying, universal basic income is going to raise inflation, it's going to create slobs, we don't know. We got to do it.
Yeah. I am with you there. I would love to see both of those experiments run. Now, speaking of experiments, James, you mentioned your brother, Mark, earlier. He's the one who introduced us, and I got to know him while I was doing some work with the Gates Foundation, where he happens to be the CEO. Given that the Gates Foundation is in a powerful position to fix a lot of the problems that you're talking about, or at least make a dent in them, right? They're trying to to eradicate disease, to fight poverty, to promote education. And a lot of the work they do is both operating through the work that we do and also affecting the structures of work in society. What have you learned in all your time as an anthropologist from hunter-gatherers that could affect either how Mark leads at the Gates Foundation or how they organize their work?
Well, I mean, look, in terms of Mark leading, I think I've taught him how to be insulted and to take insults with proper good grace. And, you know,
He is very good at that. Are you taking credit for it?
Yeah, we had a combative childhood. Look, I think, you know, again, I mean, it's interesting. Mark and I represent two quite different trajectories in life, but from the same place, the same time, and the same school. He did actually come out to the Kalahari very briefly in like 1993, and ended up in a fancy lodge, which was more of his thing. You know, if there are lessons I'd like to take from it, I mean, for me, the wonder of hunter-gatherer life, and this is another thing for me, is, again, I keep going back, and I suppose this is, you know, from too many nights sleeping under the stars. You know, there's a great peace that comes to me through the natural world. And I think many people are actually denied this. I mean, I'm amazed at when I take people from the UK out to the Kalahari and they see what a sky looks like. And they realize how full of noise the night is. And these are not sirens. I mean, just unbelievable noise everywhere in life. And so for me, there's a great environmental thing. And I'm glad Bill's suddenly focused some attention on climate. But the truth is, you know, we can't live in a soiled world. It's for me very obvious. And when you see the decay, and again, I say it's like so much of it happens below. Divers, you know, I've dived ever since I was in my 20s as well, and you see that underneath the shimmering surface, you see the decay. And the extraordinary thing, though, is, you know, there's recent genomic research has revealed that Homo sapiens have been around 300 millennia plus. When I did my PhD in anthropology in 1990, we weren't even sure if Homo sapiens were around for 60,000 years. So the time scales have expanded. We also know from the same genomic studies, for example, that the descendants of the Jnwasi, or the ancestors, I beg your pardon, in fact, of all those Khoisan people, remained in southern Africa. There's a distinctive genetic trail, LOD1 it's called, that's being just there. And so these people were there for 300,000 years, which was adapting through glacial changes. This is a group of people, you know, they survived and stayed, and they didn't mess anything up substantially. They rode with the winds. I do worry that, you know, we're not just squandering our prosperity, we're cannibalizing our future. And the lesson out of today is, you know, humankind's been around 300,000 years. Let's not screw it up now. That's what I'd like to tell Bill. Mark won't let me see Bill, though.
I think Bill is on board with that message. I think he's internalized it. James, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and I love the way that you encourage us to look to the past for insight and inspiration for the future. I think that's something we could all do more of.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure, and hopefully if I do another book, we can do this again.
Can't wait.